All right, guys, right now we're going to do part two on our lesson on homicide. So, what we're going to look at today are the different types of manslaughter that exist. And if you'll recall from the last slideshow I did here, we are using Pennsylvania law. So, what we're looking at here, guys, is voluntary manslaughter. And can be a fairly difficult concept because there are actually several different types of manslaughter that fall under voluntary manslaughter. All right. So the first one that we're going to talk about, and this is the one that tends to be the easier of the two, involves what are called heat of passion crimes. And a heat of passion crime is basically when something happens that essentially triggers a response in you that is so violent, you end up killing someone, and it's so sudden that you don't even have time to think about what you're doing. All right. So here are the elements. So you have to have a killing, and that's, of course, for any homicide. You have to have someone that dies. And the killing has to occur when the defendant is under the intense and sudden passion resulting from serious provocation. And this provocation has to be more than mere words. So you can't kill someone who said something to make you angry. You have to actually see an event happening, and we'll go over that in a moment. All right. And the person who ends up being killed has to either be the one who does the provocation, or you have to intend to kill the person that provoked you, but someone else is accidentally killed. And the key here, in addition to the sudden intense provocation, is that there can be no cooling off period. In other words, if you have any opportunity to think at all about what you're doing and you decide to go through with the action that results in someone dying, then all of a sudden you've had a chance to premeditate. So it could shift it from voluntary manslaughter to murder in the first degree, which is a huge shift in terms of penalty. Okay, so what do you guys think is really the classic scenario here? All right, the classic scenario is when you have one spouse walk in on the other spouse and they catch them cheating. All right, so husband walks in on his wife and she is having an affair. In the heat of passion, he kills the wife and or the person who is involved in the affair. This is voluntary manslaughter. All right, you come home from work early, you walk into your home, and you literally see it happening in front of you with your own two eyes. Okay, now in that case, it would have to be something that was immediate. Let's say you had time to actually leave the room. You leave the house. Even if you don't leave the house, you might just leave the bedroom and walk into another room of the house to retrieve a weapon. Courts have said that in that time, even if it's only 30 seconds, 1 minute, that's enough to constitute a cooling off period. If you walk down to the car, take the gun out of your glove box and walk back into the house and then shoot your wife, even if you are still enraged, that's enough time that you had to think about it. And now what you're doing is you're committing homicide. That is murder, not homicide. That is voluntary manslaughter. Okay. So since you have time to cool off, now I know you might be thinking, yeah, there's no way. I've been mad before and 1 minute's not enough to cool off. We're talking legally speaking here, guys. The court's not going to give you a lot of leeway here. This is a special rule that applies basically if you snap and you act so quickly that you don't have time to think about what's going on. Okay. I usually call this voluntary manslaughter type 1. That's not really a legal term. That's just what I do in class so that you don't get the two mixed up. So if you decide to practice law one day, you're not going to have a client that's on trial for voluntary manslaughter type 1. It's not like diabetes where there's like an actual difference between type 1 and type 2. This is just the label that I give them for class. Okay, there are two different types of voluntary manslaughter. I call them type 1 and type 2, just so that you guys know what I'm talking about in class. The second one, type 2, is the one that's a little bit more difficult for students to wrap their head around. Okay, so in this case, we have a person that intentionally or knowingly kills the victim. So you know what you're doing is killing someone. You are doing it intentionally. And at the time of the killing, you believe that the circumstances justified the killing. Okay, so we're going to put ourselves in the point of view of the defendant, the person who committed the killing. All right. If the person believes that they were justified it could be mitigated to voluntary manslaughter. However, if your belief is unreasonable, okay? So if you believe you're justified and you are justified, that's actually a defense, okay? If someone breaks into my house and waves a gun at me and I kill them, I believe I was justified and I actually was justified, okay? That's going to be no crime. That's self-defense. Now, let's say that I believe I'm justified, but in fact I was not, and it was not reasonable for me to think that I was justified. Okay, then we're going to have this bumped down to voluntary manslaughter type 2. Okay, so here's an example. During an altercation, the defendant shows a gun. So let's say we have two people that are fighting. The defendant flashes a gun and says like, hey, I've got a gun on me, almost like a threat, okay? So the victim then punches the defendant falls. So the defendant who has the gun is laying on the ground, but now fears for his own life because the victim is punching him. And this is based on an actual case that happened. All right. So the defendant fires the gun at the victim as the victim is running away. This was a case that was in Allegheny County. The victim starts to run away, and the defendant, who had been pushed to the ground seconds earlier, is now firing at the victim as he runs away. Okay. Guys, we haven't done defenses yet, but for self-defense, once you're no longer in danger, once the person who was the initial aggressor starts to retreat, you can't follow them and follow up with an attack. All right. So in this case, if the defendant would have been laying on the ground as the victim was punching him repeatedly, and he fired the gun at the victim, that might have been self-defense. But at this point, the victim has already started running away. It's all happening so fast, the defendant pulls out his gun and shoots, okay? He argued that he believed he was justified because everything happened so fast. And 1 second he's laying on the ground being punched by someone who's much bigger than him, and the next second the person's running away, and he didn't have time to properly react. And the court said, yes, this is voluntary manslaughter. Right? He intended to kill the person. It was unreasonable for him to shoot at someone running away, but he believed that he was justified. Okay, so that's what we see here. All right. Okay. I skipped that slide because that was just me explaining the case. Involuntary manslaughter is when you have an unintentional killing, so you do not intend to kill someone, and your conduct is reckless or grossly negligent, and it causes extreme danger of death or bodily injury. Okay? Pennsylvania, this is classified as a misdemeanor of the first degree, which means you can get 2.5 to 5 years in prison. So what would be an example here? Speeding a lot. I don't mean going 45 in a 35-mile zone. You could say driving your car 100 miles per hour could constitute involuntary manslaughter. This one's a little dicey. I put this example in because I've had students in the past argue, well, that could actually be murder, because at that point you're driving so fast that it could constitute, the requisite intent for murder because you have an extreme disregard for human life. That's quite possible. If you're speeding and it's deemed reckless, then it's usually going to be involuntary manslaughter, okay? Let's say you're sitting there and you're playing with a gun that you know is loaded, but you're just sort of playing around with it, and all of a sudden the gun goes off, and there are other people in the room. That could be involuntary manslaughter because you are acting in a manner that you're putting others in at the risk of death because of your own gross negligence. Playing with a loaded gun is grossly negligent. Gross negligence is, beyond regular negligence. So you're not just being careless at this point, you're being really careless. So that's what constitutes involuntary manslaughter. Those are the 2 types of manslaughter. 3, if you count voluntary manslaughter, as 2 different types that we see in Pennsylvania. And there are a couple other ones that I want to go over quickly, and these ones are ones that are sort of changing. Some of the laws here have been shifting a bit, especially with result to the drug crimes. We'll get to that in a second. The first one that I want to put here is causing suicide. Causing suicide and aiding suicide, which is on the next slide, are 2 different things. Causing suicide is when you cause another to commit suicide intentionally by force, duress, or deception. So an example would be if you tell someone, either you kill yourself or I'm going to kill your child. All right, this is a very dark example, of course. Um, in that case, the person might kill themselves, and then you go to court and you say, well, I didn't kill them, they killed themselves. That's not going to be a defense. You basically force them to do it, or you put them in a situation of such duress that they felt like they needed to do it. All right. Aiding suicide is a little bit different. Aiding suicide is when you have someone that intentionally aids or solicits another to commit suicide, and the conduct must actually cause the suicide or an attempted suicide. And this we sort of see evolving in the area of bullying. And there was a case not that long ago, and I should have looked it up before I started this because I can't remember the girl's name, but it was a girl whose boyfriend was suicidal, and he was sitting in his truck and he was on the phone with her, and he was going on and on about how he wanted to kill himself, but then he wasn't sure if he could actually go through with it. And she basically talked him into it. You need to do this, you can do it, all of that stuff. And then he did kill himself. So the question is, is she aiding him? Is she soliciting him to commit suicide? Is she asking him to do it? And then he actually did, as a result, commit suicide. All right, and then this one, guys, this is the one that we start to see being used a little bit more often, and this is drug delivery resulting in death. And there's been a shift recently over the past few years in the way that we're approaching the war on drugs, if you will. It used to be that we looked at putting the people who are actually doing the drugs into prison, and now the shift is aimed at the drug dealers. So instead of trying to incarcerate the people who are taking the drugs and overdosing, we're looking at the people who are putting those drugs on the street, hoping that if we can sort of cut it off at the pass, then there won't be the same availability and fewer people will actually do the drugs. So in this case, we have to have someone that intentionally gives, sells, or otherwise distributes any controlled substance or counterfeit controlled substance. So you could sell someone something that is the drug that you claim it is, or they use this a lot when you sell someone something and say, this is heroin, but it's actually laced with something, and then they overdose and die from that. Either one, okay? If the person dies as a result of using the drugs, then you as the drug dealer are facing up to 40 years in prison. So they're making the penalty very steep here because, again, the thinking is, well, instead of aiming for the people who are doing the drugs, who oftentimes are addicted, right? Let's treat those people instead as having a disease, addiction, try to treat their addiction, and let's actually shift the punishment to the people that are feeding the drugs into society because they're doing it for a profit. They're motivated by greed as opposed to this disease. Okay, guys, so those are all the different types of homicide. Hopefully you watched the first video on murder. If you didn't, make sure you go back into it. They're not all the types of homicide in Pennsylvania, but they're all the ones that we're going to cover in class. And as always, if you have any questions, just go ahead and put them below and I'll answer them. All right, guys, have a great day.